Have you ever found yourself in a rousing discussion and thought, this should definitely be a podcast, but had no clue where to go from there? Chances are you all have one or two podcasts that you listen to, and I'll bet that some, if not most of you, have even considered starting your own. I've successfully launched 4 different podcasts that have reached over 1,000 downloads. And while those numbers seem modest, I still consider each launch a success because I achieved my specific objectives. But more on that in a bit. Today, we're going to talk about planning your podcast, developing your podcast, and launching your podcast. While this may seem difficult or unfeasible, it's actually quite simple to create and launch your very own podcast. So, to begin, plan your podcast. The first step in planning your podcast is to determine your objectives. And while I can think of countless reasons why you might want to start a podcast, I'm going to go over 2 of the most popular reasons. The first is to create a following and then monetize it using paid advertising or by putting your content behind a paywall using something like Patreon. The second popular reason is to use your podcast as a marketing tool to bring awareness to your other business. The second step in planning your podcast is to define your audience. The more specific, the better. So for example, if you were thinking about doing a movie podcast, why not do 90s action movies if that's something that is appealing to you? Or maybe rom-coms if you're passionate about that. Or maybe you're into sports and you're thinking about doing a football podcast. It's kind of general. What about college football? A little better. Or the SEC in particular? Much better. These niches have a cult following that you're trying to tap into. Now that we've planned our podcast, it's time to develop our podcast. And this is the fun part. So we're going to take all those crazy ideas that we've had for months, and we're going to shape all of that into an outline. Your outline should be detailed, but loose enough so that it sounds natural. A word of caution here. Gimmicks get old. So if you're thinking about doing a recurring bit or a joke, it may be funny at first. Is it still going to be funny 10, 20, 50 weeks down the road? If you're unsure, probably better scrap it. When you're creating your outline, use a platform that allows for collaborative editing, something like Trello or Google Docs. This will be great, especially if you're working with a partner. And once you have a solid outline, comes the really fun part, recording and editing your show. When it's time to record and edit, keep these things in mind. Use basic equipment and upgrade over time. Do not buy a bunch of expensive gear. You don't need to. You can get everything you need for less than $100, even if you're starting from scratch. If you're recording with guests, make sure you iron out any technical issues up front, and if possible, have a backup plan. And finally, practice, practice, practice. Podcasting is fun, but there's a learning curve and it takes some time, so be patient with yourself. And now comes the scary part. It's time to launch your podcast. First, you need to select a hosting platform. This is where you're going to upload your audio file, and from there it gets pushed out to any podcast directories that you've registered with, like Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher. Take your time with this, read the fine print, make sure that you find a host that works for you, that you like. Once you've uploaded your content onto the podcast host, it is difficult to switch to a different host. Take advantage of any free trials. Most of the major podcast hosts have free trials. So while you may not want to upload your content right away, you can get behind their paywall and see what's going on, click around, make sure that you're comfortable with the user interface. This is important because you're going to be spending a lot of time on that website. And once you've selected your host, you need to decide on your release schedule. Be realistic. Don't set a goal of releasing a new episode every week if that's going to be hard for you, because it only gets harder over time. So You can always add, it gets harder to take away. So be realistic with yourself. Upload your episodes in advance and schedule the release. Consistency is key. In conclusion, today we talked about how to plan, develop, and finally launch your podcast. This may have seemed difficult or unfeasible at first, but hopefully now you see it's actually quite simple. I encourage you to sit down and start planning. You may very well have the next great podcast on your hands.